Okay, I imagine people will be still trickling in, but I think in the interests of keeping things on time, I'm going to begin. First of all, good evening. My name is Phillip Drake. I'm the Center for International Studies Lecturer on Environmental Studies, and I'm pleased to welcome you to Displaced, Land Grabs, and the Politics of Biofuels. This event is presented by the Center for International Studies, the Program on the Global Environment, and the Environment, Agriculture, and Food Working Group as part of the Global Energy Series, which is a year-long inquiry into the ecology, science, and politics of energy in the 21st century. Upcoming events, which I think we've posted right here, include, in the Global Energy Series, include a lecture on the myths and realities of hydrofracking by Anthony Ingrafia of Cornell University, and that's on Thursday, January 23rd at 5:30. Next month, on February 20th, we have an event titled From Field to Fuel, The Economics of Biofuel Energy, which will feature presentations by two acclaimed energy economists, Colin Carter from UC Davis and Madhu Khanna from UIUC. Please visit cis.uchicago.edu/energies for more information. Tonight's event, Displaced, Land Grabs, and the Politics of Biofuels, explores the politics of land associated with the global rise of biofuel production. Biofuels, ethanols and diesels made from the likes of corn, soy, sugarcane, palm oil, and switchgrass increasingly define a significant part of the world's agricultural and energy landscapes. This panel draws on research from Southeast Asia and Brazil to analyze how land grabs to form biofuel plantations have affected local communities. Each of our panelists will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes. Afterwards, we invite you to participate in a question-and-answer period. Now, let me briefly introduce our panelists in the order that they will be speaking. First, we have Tania Murray Li, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Toronto, and Canada Research Chair in the Political Economy and Culture of Asia. Her research has focused on questions of culture, economy, environment, and development in Indonesia's upland regions. She has written about the rise of Indonesia's indigenous peoples movement, land reform, rural class formation, and struggles over forests and conservation. Her publications include the book The Will to Improve, Governmentality, Development, and the Practice of Politics. Next, we will hear from Paul Gellert, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. His research and many publications explore a range of issues, including the political economy of development, natural resources, states, capital, and peripheral development, comparative historical sociology, and development theory. Regionally, he focuses on Asia, specifically Indonesia, where he has spent many years living and conducting research, including as a Fulbright Senior Scholar at Paramadina University in Jakarta. Finally, we have LaShandra Sullivan, Scholar in Residence at Reed College's Department of Anthropology. Her research examines the expansion of agribusiness in Brazil and resulting land disputes with social movements. Her dissertation, titled The Space to Be Ourselves, Ethnicity, Agribusiness, and Land Conflict in Brazil, is an ethnography of roadside squatter camps of indigenous and non-indigenous land protesters in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul. Please join me in welcoming our panel to UChicago this evening. So we'll begin with Tania Murray Li, whose presentation is titled Palm Oil Politics.
Okay, great. Good evening. Thanks for coming out on cold, snowy evening to hear this talk. Do I need this? Do I need the mic? Better? Okay, use it. So in my talk today, I'm going to talk very much at the muddy or the field or the production end of biofuels. I understand that your next event in this series is called From Field to fuel. And the final one is about the actual technology of producing biofuels. So mine, I think it's appropriate that I come first and that this session comes first, in the sense that this really is the kind of the muddy production end, the place where the stuff is grown, where biofuels are actually take place in fields. And my focus then is not on the oil, but the palm. So it's not so much about palm oil politics, what happens to the oil afterwards, but the oil palm, the tree, where it gets placed in the landscape, who grows it, what happens to those people. So of course, from the farmer's point of view, or from the grower's point of view, the worker's point of view, they actually don't care too much what happens to it after it leaves the farm. For them, the key thing is the price. This is a thing which you can grow and it has a price. Whether it then goes to make lipstick or margarine or ends up in ethanol or ends up as a fuel is actually not so important to them. Their concern is that they can grow something that has a good price. But of course, the current and projected use of palm oil as a biofuel is very important. First of all, because of the market price, the fact that this is what's called a flexi crop. It can be both a food and a fuel and an industrial input, means that the market for it is virtually bottomless and the price is very good. So the biofuel is an element of the expansion of oil palm. Secondly, that is, of course, is affecting investors' willingness to move into this crop, the sense that sooner or later the price will rise or will at least be sustained. This is a sure bet because of its use as a biofuel, among other things. And thirdly, there's what one could call the kind of halo of green goodness. There's the idea that because this has been billed as a sustainable energy, as a green energy, a green crop, and so on, that the people who are involved in growing it are therefore virtuously helping to secure the future of the planet. And that kind of legitimation for the expansion of oil palm is very important. Globally, and certainly in Indonesia, which is the country I'll be talking about, governors and district heads and so on are very keen to tell a visitor how their expanded production of this crop is going to provide fuel for the world, and people's cars in Europe are going to be running around on Indonesian palm oil, and this is a very important part of the legitimation and the enabling environment in which this expansion is taking place. So Indonesia currently has about 10 million hectares already planted with oil palm and is planning at least 10 million more. So the government wants to see 20 million hectares. What this means is that, for better or worse, already at least 10 million and probably 20 million people have had their lives radically transformed by the arrival of this crop, and millions more will experience its effects in the years to come. So it's massively present. 10 million hectares, 10, 20 million people whose lives are completely absorbed and have, as I will explain, been changed in every way, socially, politically, culturally, productively, in every way by the arrival of this crop. So that seems to be something we should be paying attention to from a human point of view. So the attendant politics then, what I'm calling oil palm politics, concerns land. It also concerns labor. Certainly it concerns the displacement of formerly viable communities and ways of life. I'm interested in these displacements, but I'm also interested in what one can think of as the emplacements, like the political and economic regimes which are put in place alongside the palm. Too often, I will argue, the regime that emerges is characterized by a form of violence which is intrinsically linked to the scale of corporate oil palm and its monopoly form. So another title for this talk could be Violence in the Monopoly Form. I think it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's not intrinsic to the palm. The palm is, by itself is innocent. It's the fact that it comes in the form of massive corporate agriculture extending 10, 20,000 hectares as far as the eye can see with no break. It's the monopoly form of the crop which is having these major social and political consequences. Put differently, the social impacts are not intrinsic to the crop itself. It can be grown by independent smallholders, and when they grow it, it actually furnishes them with very good profits and a decent life, enough money to send their kids to college. An oil palm smallholder with 4 hectares of this crop can do very well. With 6 hectares, they can keep the crop productive, send kids to school, save a little bit to invest in some more. Basically, they can be, it's a very lucrative crop and smallholders love it. So when they have plenty of land, smallholders often opt to plant some of it, but being smallholders, they tend to have many irons in the fire, and they may well have this alongside other crops, traditional cash crops of the region like rubber and pepper. In smallholders' hands, you'll get a more broken landscape. Nevertheless, they are very keen on oil palm because it's extremely lucrative, relatively easy to grow, low labor, and has this marvelous and sustained market price. So what I want to mainly explore then is the corporate form, the monopoly form, and what goes on around it. So to explore this, I've been carrying out research for the last 3 years in West Kalimantan, one of the provinces of Indonesia, together with an Indonesian colleague, Pujo Smedi, and who's also an anthropologist like me, assisted by around 100 students from our 2 universities. So what this approach enabled us to do was to scatter students in groups of 2 and 3 throughout the oil palm zone. So living in the core of the plantation and kind of worker housing among smallholders, on the edge of the system where farmers have 1 foot in, 1 foot out, basically to have a fairly comprehensive view of life among the palms. Like how is the arrival of the palm affecting different groups of people. And the title of our project was Producing Wealth and Poverty in Indonesia's New Rural Economies, and that title reflected our premise that we would see wealth being produced alongside poverty. And of course, both of those things are true, right? The promoters of oil palm emphasize the wealth. The opponents and the critics highlight the poverty. Both are present. So what we were trying to do then is, rather than adjudicate whether oil palm is good or bad, we wanted to look at how these different patterns were actually being produced. Like who was being enriched by this, who was being impoverished by this, through what kinds of mechanisms. And more than that, we wanted to look, as I said, at what's the form of life that emerges among the palms, which isn't a question limited to gain and loss, but encompasses a much wider spectrum of political and economic relations. So the polarized debate, which you may be aware of, perhaps that's what even draws you to this topic, between oil palm's producers and its critics, has caused a narrowing of the research agenda so far, at least in Indonesia, which we wanted to expand in several ways. First of all, critics tend to focus their attention on places where people have mobilized to protest, usually against some especially serious or unusual problem, usually connected to land acquisition or so-called land grabbing by corporations, sometimes related to environmental quality, pollution of water, reduction of water sources, and so on, or smallholder grievances. So you tend to get a focus in the advocacy literature on worst-case scenarios, right? Places where something especially dramatic or egregious has happened. And of course, there's plenty of that. We deliberately, however, selected a location in which nothing unusual had happened. No NGOs had been involved. There were no media reports about this place. Hence, our findings cannot be dismissed or applauded as either the best or the worst-case scenario. Rather, they represent business as usual in a randomly selected, unexceptional place. So of the 10 million hectares of oil palm in Indonesia, quite a bit of it will look pretty much like the scene I'm describing. So secondly, both the promoters and the detractors, or the critics of oil palm, tend to pay not too much attention to the history of the landscapes and the livelihoods and the identities of people before oil palm. For the promoters, the argument is that oil palm brings new economic opportunities and introduces a dynamism that was previously lacking. The assumption is that these landscapes before oil palm were mainly forested, often described as underutilized or wasteland. There's also an assumption that the people who were there were backward, were static, unchanging from one decade to the next. They were both traditional and poor, and what they needed most of all was the dynamism of this wonderful new development of the land, which would bring them into the modern era. So that's the kind of that's the advocate, the industry perspective. Critics, on the other hand, tend to emphasize that the land was well used by the customary landholders who obtained excuse me, decent livelihoods while sustaining the ecological balance, right? The critics of oil palm will tend to say things were just fine before. There were people here, they were producing, they were in control of their own resources, producing usually a mix of food and cash crops. The classic cash crop of this area is rubber, which has been there for almost a century. So their campaigns really emphasized the intact customary community, which was doing well before this crop arrived to disrupt and destroy things. So in an interesting way, they also stress the relatively static character of these places before oil palm. The difference is they think that this relatively static character is a good thing, right? It's something to be sustained and applauded rather than evidence of backwardness and something which needs to be changed through this dynamic. So what we are interested in, of course, is by taking a more ethnographic or anthropological view, trying to understand who these people really are, who they were before the arrival of the crop, and how they have responded to it, not universally either embracing or rejecting it, but definitely approaching it from the perspective of their previous history, which included rubber production. They're not new to markets, they're not new to cash crops. From some perspectives, this is just another crop in a series that they've been exposed to and which they tend to evaluate in terms of, well, is it going to be good for us or not? Is it easy to grow? Is it lucrative? What are the relations surrounding it? Those tend to be the pragmatic kinds of things that smallholders evaluate. And in general, as I said, smallholders like oil palm because it's extremely lucrative, relatively easy to grow, and they're keen on it. But the problem is they've actually had rather little opportunity to plant it because the form in which oil palm has come into Indonesia, Malaysia, which produce about 90% of the world's oil palm, is mainly in the large-scale corporate plantation form. So although smallholders like it, they have difficulty actually retaining enough land when the corporations come in order to be able to actually plant it. So that's really the main source of grievance. It's not a complete rejection of oil palm, it's a rejection of a politics in which they end up landless while a very lucrative plantation comes up next door, growing a crop that they would also actually like to participate in. So I'll try to just give you a little visual sense of this. The prosperous oil palm, prosperous smallholder, this guy has 20 hectares of oil palm and with the proceeds, a trucking business. The guy on the other side, a landless family in a plantation enclave, dependent on casual wage work. So that's pretty much like the wealth and poverty of the oil palm economy. This is what a government map of oil palm concessions. So what it shows is that practically every inch of land in this district has been allocated. The colored blocks are corporate allocations, so corporate concessions. So all of the land, and this is about 10 years old. Now every nook and cranny here has at least one and sometimes two overlapping concessions on it. So this is definitely a blanketing of the landscape by the corporate form. And to the extent that you might find people here, where you will find them is, so this is what the blanket looks like. Basically oil palm as far as the eye can see. You can go into one of these plantations and you could drive for days, seeing an entirely homogeneous, monotonous landscape. You wouldn't find a village, you were unlikely to find a worker, and you won't find any signposts. It's very easy to get lost. It's basically industrial agriculture on a massive scale. And that in the middle there is a oil palm mill, a factory. This is what an enclave looks like. So the corporations, sensibly enough, very seldom evict people, because you can well understand how if you evict people, they're going to protest. They're bound to protest, right? I mean, no one likes to be evicted. So what they tend to do is to do what they call enclaving, which is to leave the people where they are and leave a little bit of land around them. So here, the enclave is the village right on the bank of the river, and the oil palm is directly behind them. So these people previously owned that land, and that was their rubber and rice land. Now the company has all of that land, and the people are still there, but they no longer have any rubber or rice land to grow anything on. So they are effectively landless now, surrounded by oil palm. In some cases, particularly 30 years ago, when land was less scarce and when the first plantation corporation came into this area, it was a state plantation, which took over from an old Dutch rubber plantation. Land was relatively abundant at the time, and people were few. So they actually left the people with reasonably large enclaves. And so for a whole generation, the farmers in those enclaves were able to continue more or less as before with rice and rubber. The oil palm, was over there on their former land, but they weren't utterly squeezed by it because there was enough land to go around. Now, a generation later, of course, their children cannot be farmers, right? There is no more land. Now the enclave suddenly looks far too small, and all of the remaining land in the entire district is under corporate oil palm. So the issue of the land grab or the land squeeze sometimes takes a while to emerge. It's not necessarily an instantaneous thing where you go from being landed to landless overnight. Some of the effects take a while to emerge, but they are extremely permanent, right? Once this crop is in the ground, it doesn't go away. This plantation is now in its second generation, so the palms begin to age around 17 years, and the advocacy, the anti-oil palm lobby groups were saying, oh, it's just for one generation, the land will be ruined, you should reject oil palm because it's just a short-term thing. Actually, it's very successfully now in its second, and in some places in its third generation. This is what it looks like. When the palms get old, they inject them with Roundup, which kills them, and they plant new ones in between. So it's kind of a cannibalistic system. And once established, oil palm requires very, very little labor. Basically, a bit in the plantation, in the planting phase, a bit now, in this case, in the replanting phase, but not as much as before. Basically, they're hiring people to dig the little planting holes, sometimes slightly terraced if it's sloping, and the new crops are in the ground, and on you go for another 20 years. So it's industrial agriculture, basically. This is what the actual work looks like. This guy is harvesting. This is what the palm looks like, and these are the fruit. So you use a long knife, a bit like a scythe on the end of a huge stick, to get the oil palm down. This tree is rather low, but sometimes they can be 20 meters, extremely, 20, no, at least 10 meters, very high. I mean, as high as the ceiling. And this guy is there with his long stick trying to get the fruit to come down. So it's manual work, extremely strenuous also. Then you pick up the fruit and load it into a truck. So these guys are loaders. This is the kind of quarters of oil palm workers, not at all luxurious. There were 10 guys actually living in this place. All oil palm harvesters. Women also work in this sector. This young woman is going out to do maintenance on the plantation, digging ditches. This woman is carrying the fruit from where they fall in the field to the roadside where they're going to be weighed. Okay, so that's basically what the landscape and what the labor process looks like. The question of grab, right? The title of this thing is Land Grabs and the Politics of Biofuels. So like I've said, first of all, the temporality means that it doesn't always necessarily feel immediately like a grab. The second thing is, or even if it is a grab, people sometimes tolerate it because they are hopeful or they believe the promises that the corporations will bring jobs, roads, development. And this has actually become far more important in the last decade because as under structural adjustment and other neoliberal policies, the government of Indonesia has basically abdicated responsibility for building infrastructure in rural areas, especially remote areas. So no one else is building roads up there. If you happen to be living in one of these out-of-the-way places, your only hope of getting a road is that a company will come in. And you know that as a result, you're going to lose a chunk of land, but you hope you'll at least keep some. And with that land, you too can plant some oil palm, still continue a bit of rubber and rice if you keep enough land, and you'll have a road. Once you have a road, you can have a properly functioning primary school. You know, teachers will actually stay, the school will open and run normally. You can even have a motorbike. And you can basically join what people understand as normal Indonesian village life, which has been extremely hard in these very remote areas. Now, not everybody wants that, of course, but a lot of people do. And so the opposition to oil palm has not been universal. Like in many cases, the plantations have been able to make enough promises to negotiate and buy their way in. Now, in the Suharto period, there was more outright grabbing because the government regarded all land as belonging to the state, and all of these people's customary rights were disregarded. Now it's a bit more complicated. The government actually does ambiguously acknowledge customary land rights. But what's happened is that the government has now said to the corporations, again in neoliberal style, we will issue you with a license. You then have to go and negotiate with the people. So it's a two-step process where you have a license, but that's then a license to go and actually secure land from the people directly. Now, you may think this is good. This gives the people the opportunity to express consent and, you know, negotiate and bargain and get a good deal. In practice, what it's turned into is a massive sea of land brokers who go around, you know, cash in hand, sometimes organizing gambling and prostitution and things, basically trying to get people into debt so that they will give up their land, or entice them with what seem in the short run like fantastic amounts of money. Of course, down the road, they're not that fantastic, right? But these are populations that are sometimes quite vulnerable to these kinds of tactics. It's still a grab, but a grab that's a bit more fragmented and dispersed. It can sometimes take these companies now 2 years to actually gather up the land, even though they have a license. It's not quite as straightforward. In the Suharto era, you arrived with your bulldozers and the army, and that was the end of the story. Now, you know, you have your bulldozers kind of at the ready, but you're a bit still in limbo and negotiating for access. The people who give up their land are often promised things like a dividend from the company. They'll get so many percentage of the profits every year. But remarkably, to me, these transactions are virtually paper-free. The company is promising these things, but the people do not actually have, you know, documents or guarantees. There is no legal contract which they can down the road enforce. So this then is why I am calling this a monopoly system. Is monopoly not only in the sense that very large corporations on massive areas of land, but monopoly also in the political sense that the corporations effectively buy and own everything, in the sense that they are inserted into the political apparatus at every level. So let's say there are some villagers who are protesting who don't want to give up the land. The companies will hire somebody that they call a human relations officer. Basically, they will bring inside anyone who's outside. Anyone who's opposing is brought into the company, paid, given a role, given an official title as the liaison officer. So opposition is brought inside. And politicians at every level are also brought inside. And this is partly structural. The government has established legislation for what they call coordination teams. So the district governor and the district head, the provincial governor, the district head, the police chief, the army, the village heads, all these people are involved in what are called coordination teams. With the company. So they work for the company. The company pays them for their role in coordination teams. So they are also inside, right? There actually is no outside. It's a monopoly system in the sense that it saturates all the political and economic relations in this kind of area. So it's not quite as straightforward as a kind of a homogenous plantation that's just grabbed everything and evicted. People are still there, but the terms on which they are there have become really dominated by this corporate form, not in its kind of legal bureaucratic sense. You might think of, a corporation brings in the rule of law and everything's very regulated. Actually, it's completely, it's jungle, right? It's one of the oil palm smallholders described it to me as a mafia system. He said, "This is a mafia system. Let me tell you how it works from top to bottom." And what he meant, you know, in Naples, the word for the mafia is o sistema, right? The system. And it was a very accurate analysis, because what he meant was that there is a system. It's not random, it's not erratic. It's that there is a system for dealing with dissent. There's a system for bringing the outside into the inside. There's a system for buying people off, or sometimes what the companies call giving them a Panadol, like quietening them down when people get too uppity. And it works both ways. So because villagers always have grievances against these companies, they always have a legitimate cause to protest. So they routinely have blockades, they threaten arson, they threaten to, basically they can extort the company every time they get upset over something, and the company then pays them, or it pays the leaders of the protest, who then pipe down and the protest evaporates. And this doesn't just happen once, this happens every year, multiple times. So this becomes part of the system. It's basically like a mafia system, a kind of a mutual extortion, in which people are being paid off, people are protesting, they're being brought back on the inside, whoever threatened to be, you know, too serious in opposition is reincorporated. The companies are also vulnerable to this, and they complain. They complain that their profits are taken up by people who are always protesting, who they have to pay off, but also by politicians who pick up the phone around election times and ask for huge payments for their election campaigns and so on. So basically, it's a monopoly system in that it saturates not just the landscape, but social and political and economic relations as well. So there's a system which, as I'm, sorry? Okay, supposed to be transparent, but actually lacks any of the kinds of checks and balances that one might expect from a corporate form with rule of law, rules and ways of doing things. This is the weighing of a smallholder's crop, but they all say, well, it's fixed, the measure is inaccurate, people put stones in with the crop in order to increase the weight, the people are cheating the company's cheating the people. It's basically it's a jungle. This is one of the main sources of contention, roads, because oil palm has to be sent to the factory within 48 hours. And so if the road is bad because of rain, look at this, the crop is ruined and the farmers are ruined, the smallholders are ruined. So there's a huge source of tension. I've mentioned companies, and there are the smallholder schemes sometimes attached to some of these corporations, and some people place a lot of hope in those with the idea that contract farming or smallholders linked to these corporations can solve some of these problems. From what I've seen, the monopoly form extends to this tied smallholding arrangement because the people have to sell to the mill. There's only one mill. It's still in a monopoly position. They're still dependent on the corporation to provide the roads. So they really are not sufficiently outside. They're not able to occupy a bargaining position. If you actually have truly independent smallholders, they do much better. So in Thailand, for example, unlike Indonesia and Malaysia, they have only small holdings. They don't have any corporate oil palm. And the smallholders are supported by a government support scheme which provides technical support. And they also have a system of mini mills. Instead of these large factories, they have mills which process enough oil from 500 hectares. So mini mills, which means competition among mills. It sounds like I'm advocating capitalism, actually, but competition is a lot better than monopoly if you are a poor person, because you want the suppliers, the providers of roads and services and milling and so on, you want them to be in competition with each other so that you can move away from the greedy and corrupt ones to the people that give you a better service, right? And so monopoly is actually really the enemy of smallholders. Nevertheless, the companies prefer the monopoly form for this reason. This is a comparison of benefits under different management regimes. And under a smallholder system, the local people are the main beneficiaries. Corporations and governments get nothing. Under a state system, the local farmers get virtually nothing. The investors get a lot, the government gets more. There's all kinds of incentives for continuation of the corporate form. Just very briefly, Malaysian and Indonesian oil palm corporations are having colonized a good 10 million hectares in Southeast Asia, are moving into Africa. So this is corporate expansion in the Congo Basin of actually Malaysian oil palm companies, which are importing the corporate form, their same plantation model, into Africa. And this stuff I won't go into. This is a map of soy, right? So this is one way of thinking about the monopoly form, kind of massive, homogeneous hectares, tractor-based. Oil palm is a bit different than that. It does involve people, more labor for sure than soy, but not that many. The industry claims that it hires 5 people per hectare, but it's actually 1 person per 5 hectares. So it does absorb some labor, but not that much. And because almost all the oil is exported crude, it's not being developed into manufacturing. So you don't get an uptake. You know, the young women have no option to go and work in factories. The young men have no other options, right? So it's a massive land gobbling, labor dispelling machine. It really doesn't require that many people. More than soy, but far less than rubber. Rubber, for example, 1 person per hectare. So if rubber comes into an area, everybody has work. If oil palm comes in, work is actually quite scarce. A lot of people will lose their land, but not be absorbed into the labor force, which is the worst thing that can happen to you if you're a rural person, unless the national economy is booming and can absorb you into other sectors. Not happening in Indonesia. Jobless growth in the last decade, a booming economy, but very few jobs. So that means that the implications of the takeover of huge swaths of land by this particular crop, not just for 1 generation, but for generations to come, as it just keeps on kind of cannibalistically reproducing itself, is rather huge, right? The opportunity cost of all the other things that land could have done, the different kinds of crops that could have been planted there, which perhaps could absorb more labor, could involve more local processing, more downstream, more multipliers, as the Economist put it. All of that is actually pretty dismal in the orbit of oil palm, just from an economic point of view. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Technology. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks, Andy, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here at the University of Chicago and be on this panel. And to be coming at biofuels, I think, in all of our talks, because we've been chatting amongst ourselves and with a few of you prior to this, related to different aspects of really the politics at different level of biofuel expansion behind maybe some of the promise for it. I have as my title, The Quest for Legal Certainty, and I think palm oil has some similarities as a commodity in the way it's playing out to oil, petroleum, which the minister of oil, I believe it was, in Venezuela, famously described as the devil's excrement. Terry Carl quotes this in her book on petroleum paradox. And I think palm oil, as Tania Li was just describing, also presents this kind of bargain that some actors are benefiting tremendously, while others are displaced as part of this land grab that's happening, maybe not as neatly and in one fell swoop as the maps that the corporate and state actors are drawing from capitals and corporate boardrooms would like to think it's happening, but nonetheless in somewhat piecemeal, it is gobbling it up the way we've just heard. And it's also enticingly touted as green, right? That it is a contributor to biofuels, a potential transition away from fossil fuels, despite negative social and environmental and perhaps even fossil fuel accounting measures of its impact. So my talk is a second one in this panel that focuses on Indonesia. I think it's complementary to the one we just heard. I focus more on the macro politics and less at the muddy ground level of oil palm plantations. I hope this leads to interesting discussion coming at it from slightly different levels of analysis. And I think we have some overlapping perspectives and maybe some small differences in how we might interpret the spread of the monopoly form. My focus is on legality, and I come at this from a sociological or political economy perspective. And I think given the complexity of the picture that you've just gathered, a lot of actors and a lot of us here might say, well, what we really need is clarity. What we really need is transparency, rule of law, accountability, clear boundaries, who can go where, whose rights to which land are in effect, and so forth. And I think many people in Indonesia as well are clamoring for rule of law as a pathway to resolve the ongoing conflicts that are occurring in many parts of the country, and in large part due to this huge expansion of palm oil. And I'd say from a political science perspective, some people view rule of law as kind of a natural step that Indonesia experienced 30 years of authoritarian rule under Suharto from about 65, 66 to 1998 when he was forced to resign. And since then has been trying to deepen its transition to democracy. And so there's a notion with some that rule of law will happen, and there's a kind of teleological argument to it. And I'm arguing against this for a more complex understanding of the expansion and kinds of rule of law and regulation that may come into play. So this presentation is actually also collaborative with an Indonesian colleague, Andiko, who works for HUMA, which is an organization based in the capital in Jakarta. It's a organization of legal activists who work for social justice and land rights. And in essence, we're arguing, and the title reflects this, that the quest for legal certainty may be quixotic, or quixotic, however you pronounce it, and that there are potentially, even from indigenous rights perspective, some cautionary notes about the seeking these rights, because rights can then be taken away or sold in the market and so forth. I wanted to start, though, with a little bit of a big picture about the global palm oil expansion to give you some macro context for this. There's been a huge expansion globally of palm oil, and you can see this in the right slide, from about 25 million tons of production in 2000 to over 50 now, so doubling of it. Palm oil is more than half of the world vegetable oil production, and it competes with soy, which, so those two together are sort of the great majority of vegetable oil production. The biofuels comes in the right side, as you can see, sort of in the mid-2000s and expands somewhat, but still the predominant uses of palm oil are in products like these. So it's in all sorts of products. There are websites out there, and the Malaysian and Indonesian palm oil producers are very angry at the consumer anti-palm oil movement, but despite all your concerns about health, it's rather difficult, actually, to avoid consuming palm oil. If you look at the range of foods and cosmetics and cleaning products and so forth that have some part of palm oil or palm kernel oil in them. So the producers, as I mentioned, are and as Tania mentioned, are dominated by Indonesia and Malaysia. It used to be even more dominated by those two. But now Thailand, as you can see, is inching upward, and the rest of the world is 10% in the African and Latin American producers. So it's a little less dominant. Indonesia overtook Malaysia several years ago, and that was part of kind of a plan that they had to become the world's #1 producer. They've achieved that. The main markets, actually, a reasonable amount of it is consumed also in Indonesia and Malaysia, and then the biggest other single markets are India and China. with the EU not far behind. So that's in terms of shaping that production. Now, in Indonesia, part of what I've traced in my research started looking at timber in Indonesia. And during the Suharto authoritarian period, there was a big focus on first log exports, at that time mostly to Japan, and then building a domestic plywood industry. So some of that domestic production was actually part of the nationalist development plan at that point, with a timber king leading the private sector, a guy named Bob Hassan. And as you can see, the first two columns that unfortunately don't have comparable data all the way across here, but are percents of non-oil exports, because Indonesia, non-oil and gas, although Indonesia now is a net oil importer and no longer a member of OPEC, they still export gas. Timber products dominated in the early 90s. In the early 2000s, the timber products had decreased somewhat, and clothing and textiles and some of the other manufacturers' products had come back. But by 2010, including oil and gas, crude palm oil, CPO there, was rising up and is a significant export from Indonesia. This kind of series of commodities from the forest that Indonesia has been exporting led me to describe it as an extractive regime. For, as I said, about 30 years, this helped to bolster the authoritarian regime, and what I've been trying to examine in recent years is the ways in which, even under democratization, a certain power configuration continues to be in place that relies on natural resource exports, and palm oil and also coal and pulp and paper for those mills. And the palm oil is the most land extensive of them. This is a picture of Indonesia's boom in palm oil, and you can see that actually it goes way back to the 70s there, and in the 80s and early 90s. The bottom, if the colors worked, yeah. The bottom blue-colored segment is the public or state-owned plantations, and that was a large segment of it until the 90s, when the private sector began to grow. Now, the private estates a few years ago was almost half of the land, of the production, and smallholders was also increasing. There's a bit of a question because some of the plantations were established under regulations that assumed that smallholders were only 2 hectares. I'd like to hear a little more, maybe we can discuss. The World Bank's defines smallholders as anybody less than 50, so there's a question about when the data shows smallholders exactly who they are, and who are the informal local big actors, or who are gathering up these small parcels and putting them together into 6, 8, 10, 20 hectares. Indonesia's CPO growth also has been very land extensive, in part because it hasn't relied much on agricultural technologies. The production has a pretty good yield, not as good as Malaysia's by comparison. At least as of a few years ago, it was 3.4 metric tons per hectare versus 2.1, and this is some data from the USDA FAS on the right, also showing the tons per hectare. I think they may be measuring this by tons sold, but the squiggly line sort of shows that there have been some increases in average yield, but over time, over a period from 1970 to 2010, not a great increase in yield. So if you're not increasing yield, but you're increasing production this much, then you have to be expansive. And so that 8 million, 9 million, 10 million hectares of land is what explains it. This has also led to changes then in the forest, and I like this slide from Carlson Kern et al. Because it also shows how the planted area hasn't yet caught up to the permitted area. And permits is the big political issue. So what they call leases here on the right is spreading. This is Kalimantan or Indonesian Borneo. The top parts there are the M's are Malaysia and then Brunei. So you see the red spreading also into high sloped areas as well, which may make it less feasible to have huge expanses of machines going through, but nonetheless, that's where it's spreading. But the right, the blue area shows the area actually planted in palm oil. So the that's the big picture. What Andiko and I have been looking at is the legal certainty question. WALHI is a big environmental organization in Indonesia. Their sort of year-end statement came out and said, well, there are 3 unfinished tasks right now for the environment, law enforcement, conflict resolution, and forest permit regulation. They want to call on the state to be a better enforcer of the laws that exist. And I would say, actually, there are lots of laws in Indonesia. And that's maybe part of the complexity is that there are too many laws. They don't all agree with one another. And so there's ambiguity and there's negotiation behind that. Friends of the Earth International on the right there is recommending, and this has been a push from NGOs for quite some time, that palm oil and other activities shouldn't be clearing land on any land without permits. And so there's a real reliance on, nothing should be done without permits or without legality. There's a push also from the international community. Some of you may have heard from of REDD, R-E-D-D, for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and a UN program that through money from Norway, $1 billion is trying to promote not converting forests, not converting further forests in that way. What I want to invite us to think about is this conflict over permits as a conflict over what Nancy Pelosi and Peter Van de Geest call political forests, which going back to colonial times have been lands that states declared as forests, whether they have trees on them or not. And so it's not a very ecological definition. It's a historical and a political one. And the conflict that I'm looking at are conflicts between elites, between the central elites of the forestry department in Jakarta and regional elites, particularly as decentralization has occurred. So the political forest in Indonesia is that forest area, which is about 2/3 of the land in Indonesia, and that's claimed by the forest department. It's then divided up into various categories of forest. But the real question behind this is who has the authority to decide how the land is used. And the question of whether is this just a legal question, divide the pie up into different kinds of forests, protect the forest here, you're allowed to convert the forest there, or whether it's a socio-political question, a question about who has power. Daniel Lev said, even in the colonial period, and then even more so following that law was used to legitimize the efficient exploitation of land and people in Indonesia, and at that time in the Dutch East Indies. And what I'm arguing is that it's happening that way now. It's happening, and we look at a couple of cases in central Kalimantan through political processes that seem to be seeking legal certainty, but beneath the surface are really about political negotiations. We focus on 3, and I'll try to run through these relatively quickly to get to the discussion. Synchronization of permits, a kind of administrative whitewashing of what forest control means, and regulation of tree crops. So there have been this TGHK abbreviation, has been around for several decades, this dividing up the forest land use into these different kinds of uses. And with democratization and decentralization, provinces began to do this. And there was a negotiation between the center and the regions over trying to fix these maps. What area could actually be used for what? Interestingly, but not surprisingly, we found that 3 of the most resource-rich provinces were the ones that rejected the Central Department of Forestry's initiative, including Central Kalimantan. And part of this is, if you look at it, that a huge percentage of the provincial land, including land that housed the governor's office, was on land that was mapped from the center as being forest area, i.e. jurisdiction of the Department of Forestry, not necessarily, again, land that had trees on it. And so this is before the 2011 negotiation of it. WALHI, again, this environmental group, tried to do an analysis of the permits that existed and some of these overlapping permits, because, so you can see there are permits for palm oil as well as mining, and some of the long-standing logging permits and tree plantations for pulp and paper are still there. The total of all the permits, as you can see, is almost 13 million in a province whose area is a little over 15 million hectares. So you have a huge amount of just overlapping of permits. There's a lot of people who have pieces of paper that say, I have the right to establish an acacia plantation here. I have the right to establish a palm oil plantation over here. They negotiated that, and the area of forested area, forest zone, decreased by 1.2 million, which meant that that 1.2 million could be used for other uses, including conversion to palm oil. So this was, we didn't have the access to hear the exact negotiations, nor do we actually have the list at this point, I haven't seen it, of which exact concessions or plots of land were moved from the forested category to the non-forested category, and then under the jurisdiction of the National Land Agency instead of the Department of Forestry. The whitewashing has to do with a kind of legal transformation that allowed the Forestry Department to maintain control of land to be used for palm oil plantations. Palm oil plantations, as you've seen now, are basically big tree farms, right? Monocrops, straight road, for as far as the eye can see. And there was a new forestry law in 1999, but it didn't specify how should land be designated to be converted to tree plantations. Then finally, in 2010, an implementing regulation was put in that said that palm oil should be in non-forest land. Well, if it's supposed to be in non-forest land, then there needs to be a process for it to go from that forest land, forest department jurisdiction and authority, to another authority. But people in the forestry department began to see, well, if we actually allow that to happen, and there are millions of hectares that are being converted to palm oil, that means that the forestry department would lose authority over those millions of hectares of land. So they then released a regulation that tried to redefine it and said, well, we'll go a different route. We'll redefine palm oil plantations as forest plantations. And there was some complexity. There was actually protest from a variety of quarters, and then they reversed the decision to the chagrin of the palm oil industry spokespeople. And so it's still in this nebulous zone where it's not supposed to be regulated by the Forest Department, but it continues. Okay. The related aspect here is whether palm oil is a tree or a crop. What is it? Which is part of the state role, but it also gets into who benefits from it. And the Forestry Department was, one of its Director General said he thought it was, they should be unwilling to sacrifice the political forest or the forest area to other institutions, meaning to the Department of Plantations or to the National Land Agency. But the Forestry Department then came in, this is the regulation, they came in and argued that because one of the uses of palm trees is for raw material as timber, they could call it a tree crop. It hadn't been before. And various people who've looked at it said that by various other characteristics, by FAO definitions, this is a tree. It's not an agricultural, sorry, it's an agricultural crop and not a tree. But they wanted to maintain that authority, so they kept it that way. I think in the background, and I have a longer paper that's under review that goes into this, there's a question of rule of law and what kind of rule of law is underlying this. In Indonesia's colonial history, they were colonized by the Dutch, and they followed German law, and which created the Rechtsstaat, or the integralist state, in which what they, in more recent years, many people in civil society have called rule of law, was really state law, or rule by rulers, as sometimes people call it, rather than rule of law. And there have been constitutional amendments that open up the possibility, sorry, I didn't finish that line, but of indigenous rights and of a rule of law that is more in the Anglo-American tradition. But it's still overlapping with this notion that if the state says it is so, then the state can do no wrong. So this notion of law as defending the people against the state is still rather new in Indonesia. And I think, I don't mean, again, sort of to go back to that teleology argument, that it's necessarily going to lead to a process where our notion of rule of law would be the one fully in place there, nor, as some of the kind of critical legal scholars in the States would say, that rule of law here is necessarily a level playing field for those of minority status in the civil rights struggles, or of less financial means to fight corporations, that corporate lawyers have a different standing in the courtroom than those of us who might want to just create one court case. So both in terms of the material political economy and in terms of law, then, to get back to that land grab question, I guess I'm looking at this more as a series of transformations in which one of the competing factors now is regional elites who are competing with central elites in the Department of Forestry, which has historically been very powerful in Indonesia. And so these cycles of extraction create overlapping frontiers of expansion, but as Tania was saying, if once one is converted into palm oil, it's unlikely then that another company would come in and convert it to acacia or albizia plantation trees for pulp and paper. So there are certain conflicts between companies as well as between this corporate expansion and smallholders. And I think at the same time, we do see what a number of scholars have said, which is a kind of primitive accumulation by dispossessing the people, maybe from some land that was only tenuously or ambiguously theirs, although indigenous rights have been claimed for a long time. And I guess what I'm using this term dispossession by accumulation for what Tania was talking about as sort of enclave, that people are remaining in situ, but they don't have the same rights and access to resources for their livelihood that they did in the past. But the application, as I put there last, it depends on one's definition of capitalism and whether property is part of that. So, and I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you all for an excellent, very provocative set of presentations. I look very much forward to the discussion here. Because we went a little bit late, I think I'm just going to turn the floor directly over to the audience and go ahead and field questions for our speakers. So we don't have any microphones to pass around to you guys, so if you could just speak up, I will pass my microphone over to our presenters.
Sorry. It's about 2.4 acres per hectare. So it's a larger number. You're talking, so 10 million is like 24 million.
I guess my question is for the Studio of Indonesia. It's about, I was hoping you could say something about the sort of large-scale efforts to halt palm oil plantations in Indonesia, specifically the UN's grant program and Norway's $1 billion pledge to Indonesia. What do you think the effectiveness of such large programs like on a halting this sort
first. I mean, I think the impulse of red is a good one. I think the potential's messy and ambiguous, and I think there've been activists trying to follow it. Greenpeace in Indonesia has been trying to trace the permits and such, but I think that a lot of the struggles are happening at these lower levels, in the provinces, in the political campaigns, on the ground at the level that Tania was talking about. So I guess part of the conclusion that I was driving towards was really more that it's these ground level politics, and one of the things that I don't see happening, or I don't hear happening either in Brazil or Indonesia, is a more unified movement that would actually promote these rights, and in part because of, I think, some of disagreements among and between different indigenous groups about the potential for palm oil.
I think you also have to look at the very pragmatically at the different incentive structures, right? What does red offer? What does oil palm offer? And at every level, if you're a villager, red basically says, we will pay you to do nothing. We don't want you to cut anything. We're not going to do anything for you either. We're not going to build you a road or a school. We just want you to keep the forest and keep as you are, right? So for villagers who are feeling neglected, they might think, we'd need a lot of money for that to be a good deal for us, right? We'd need, but they may be tempted, on the other hand, by an oil palm company which says, we're going to build you a road and a school and all kinds of promises met and unmet. So that's at the very village level. There's some longhouses upriver, one of which has painted itself red, basically saying, red, come here, and others which are rejecting red in favor of oil palm. So it's at that level, but also look at the incentive structures in other ways, right? As I said, the oil palm corporations have ways of being in bed with local politicians and strongmen. There's lots of incentives to let them in because the money is rather distributed on a broader chain. With red, you have to look at who actually would get their of this 1 billion Norwegian dollars, or $1 billion from Norway, who would get, where would it flow? Who would actually follow the money? And then you will have a sense of what sets of incentives are being constructed and what the likely fallout is going to be. My sense is that it'll be determined on those grounds rather than on grounds of virtue.
One last thing is that with so far, even Red Plus being a large project and getting a lot of research attention, nothing's happened. I don't think the $1 billion has been fully dispersed, so the Indonesian government hasn't gotten all of that, and all of it has been focused on future permits, future plantations, when in fact the country has already covered multiple times with existing permits. So in some ways it's ambitious but not ambitious enough. So it's
I know that biofuels are really complicated and they have pros and cons in each of your respective areas of study, but if you had to give a recommendation, I guess, to continue biofuel, the crop expansion, palm oil expansion, and sugarcane expansion, or ramp it down, which one would you argue in your region, and if so, then with what stipulation?
I wish that I could give a general answer. I will try to answer it through the particularities of where I work in the case that I'm describing. In this, reminds me of a conversation I was having earlier with my co-panelists. The people themselves who are involved in sugarcane, involved in the production of ethanol fuel, are attempting to intervene in the course of how production processes are carried out. And there are structural impediments, there are structural barriers to how politics, to what degree of power they have in determining their own lives. And so it's difficult to sort of formulate a policy recommendation or, or even just a list of pros and cons outside of the voices of the people who themselves are attempting to intervene in these production processes. I think there has to be a place in which the people who are attempting to have some political power or to intervene in these processes can actually be heard, and they are divergent. One of the things that was pointed out about Indonesia, that there isn't a uniform, there's not a monolithic viewpoint on the part of the people who are impacted. And then there has to be a way to incorporate the variety, the contentiousness of the issues amongst the people who are politically involved in it. And so I would say that's the place that's where the question should really be focused and to lies, and in these different sites of production of biofuels. And given the longer history in which this particular moment in which biofuels is taking place is transpiring, what are the terms for politics and the types of political processes that are unfolding in these places in which we can understand the direction of biofuels and where its production should go? I'm sure that's not a satisfactory answer. But I think there has to be an onus on the particularities of these very different sites with these different histories and different social processes unfolding as it regards biofuel production.
I would just say, in regards to oil palm, there's nothing wrong with the crop. It's an incredibly lucrative, productive crop. Farmers like it. The problem is with the monopoly form. So I think the emphasis should be, it's too big a ship to turn around. You can't stop, I think, the expansion of oil palm. But the disgusting, disgraceful kinds of political economic relations which surround plantation agriculture in this kind of lawless, thuggish, mafioso form which exists there, that's something we don't need, right? That's instilling a form of life for generations to come which is truly ugly. And that's not a necessary correlate of the palm. So that's where I would put the emphasis. I mean, in some ways, it kind of relates to what Sullivan is saying in the sense of, if the people are not rejecting oil palm, who are we to reject oil palm, right? But if the people are rejecting it, we have to look at why they're rejecting it. And it's probably for good reasons, because they can see that the price they're being asked to pay in terms of losses and in terms of the presence of some big ugly corporation in their lives is also too high, right? So in that sense, it has to go back to the question of democracy, the question of, how, and I think building on what the discussion of law, it doesn't reside in law and regulation. Those things there's tons of them, but it really is the power relations on the ground, how these things get worked out. That's the core of it, and that's the most scary part, actually.
Sugarcane. Is it the kind of thing that you could just take and put in the car, or does it require a great deal of
You have the comparison.
I can't speak to palm oil in terms of the.
Well, I have an idea what both sugarcane and corn are in terms of making ethanol, but I'd like to know, where does palm oil stand in this? Because it's very important that we find these things and do something with it. We got to take care of these horrible social problems that they're creating, but we also got to take care of global warming. And if this is an extremely productive fuel, I mean, if it works better than, say, corn, which hardly works at all, it's something that I'd like to know.
My sense is that other speakers in this series will be much better. That really is their expertise, the economics of these different kinds of biofuels. I mean, what I do know is that the oil palm is the most productive source of oil, of an edible oil. It's much more productive than any of the other seeds. And it has some remarkable qualities. You squeeze the oil out of this thing, and then there are the leftover bits from the palm kernels, you put them back on the land as fertilizer. Like it's an incredibly productive, efficient crop from that point of view. But from the conversion to ethanol, that part I don't know.
I can answer it very, very briefly. I mean, it's about, palm oil is about middle of the way in terms of energy content per kilogram. The ones that have the most energy are basically the animal fats and jatropha in terms of the oil-producing plants. Jatropha has the most energy content for palm is about middle.
I mean, one thing I would sort of add to that, which is a bit of a different road, but part of what I was trying to get across in my talk was to get with biofuel production in Brazil, it's not the effectiveness as an alternative to petroleum that's driving the production. Instead, I think we have to think about it's not for the use value of ethanol fuel that's driving the expansion of biofuel production. Instead, it's being driven by political processes in Brazil that preceded the rise in biofuel production. That's so the question of how viable is it as an alternative to petroleum is kind of getting away from how we should really be understanding what's driving the biofuel production.
I want to thank our speakers for these really wonderful presentations, and I was struck by a point that Sullivan and Paul both raised about how landscapes are imagined as part of the processes unfolding by which various forms of biofuels are being cultivated, and that they're not empty. If what they consist of is being argued about at various levels. So is this land a forest or is it not a forest? Who has the authority to draw a boundary? Is this land a frontier? Is it inhabited? According to whom? Who has a right, a history of using land? So on and so forth. And as I was thinking about the title of the lecture and some of the powerful images and descriptions that our speakers offered, I realized that the title doesn't fully encapsulate what's going on, that rather than simply having people displaced, we're having people enclaved or encamped, something that I think came across very powerfully in Tania's presentation as well as in Sullivan's presentation. And I was wondering if you all could speak to how livelihoods, social structures, and even broader political economy of everyday life is being transformed through these new economic engines, but economic engines that typically benefit a small few in the wake of encampments and enclaves being produced.
Whomever.
Well, I mean, life in the enclave depends entirely on the corporation. So if there's jobs, you work. As one of the people said to me, if the company gives us work, then we eat. I mean, it's an incredibly dependent position unless there's other things going on in the national economy to draw people out. So I think life in the enclave has to be seen in relation to what else is going on in the province and in the nation. So the question for me, the question of land is very much linked to the question of labor. I know it's something you're also interested in, surplus populations which are not absorbed into work. That's a big deal, right? A lot of people would prefer not to be farmers, and they'd quite prefer not to be living in these little enclaves, but there's nothing else out there for them. So I think the question of livelihood is both local, but is also happens at other scales in the question of what other alternatives are being produced. Something which could improve livelihoods greatly is in-country processing. Like if there was indeed if there were factories producing lipstick in Kalimantan that these people could go and work at, they would be okay with having less land. But those alternatives are not, all the oil is exported crude. There's no local processing, so there's no multiplier. Livelihoods are not being expanded by this. Again, there's a difference. In the areas where smallholder oil palm is independent or working well, you see amazing multipliers. You see that people are building their houses, there's local transportation networks, there's money around, people are prospering. And so not only owners of land, but the people who put the satellite dish for your TV, you know, all kinds of small businesses prosper if the people are prospering. Unfortunately, the corporate form does not do that. Wages are minimal, they're really pressed down, so you don't get the multipliers that you would have if you were doing oil palm a different way. So I think the livelihood question, I mean, this decent livelihoods can be made in and around oil palm if it's organized in certain ways.
Well, I guess I agree with that. I think Robeson and Hadiz have been arguing that power has been reorganized in Indonesia. And so the inequalities of the authoritarian period are being reproduced, but in multiple places in the democratizing period. And I guess I side with them on that. So I think for me, in terms of how is it being transformed, it's becoming more unequal. And so I agree it's not necessarily inherent to palm oil, but I think what we see is the spread actually of neoliberal global capitalism. And so, I mean, it's interesting to me that there's a contrast in Thailand, and I'd be interested to investigate that more. I think, you know, if I think towards more positive scenarios, I do think towards more small and medium scale sharing of benefits, cooperatives, and in local industries and the like, that where there would be a balancing of a highly unequal political economy in Indonesia, where these choices are being made under such constrained circumstances, so that they're not very great choices. And so I agree with not condemning the choices, but the conditions of the choices are terrible. So, you know, in terms of the earlier question about what do you recommend, I don't really recommend any further expansion of palm oil. If I see the country is already, you know, sort of laid over at the map level with palm oil all over the place, there's enough. It sort of needs to be reorganized and made more equitable from inside.
Yeah, I think the points that you guys are, that Tania and Paul, I'm sorry, it's blinked, are making is a really powerful one as far as connecting it to the existing alternatives beyond the enclave in your case, or in my case, or in the case that I'm looking at with the camps, what is driving people to the camps, the sort of structural conditions for the reproduction of daily life are such that the camps are sort of hold out the possibility for a livable life that is not the sort of immiserated conditions in which they otherwise live. And it makes me sort of think about, as far as for the future, sort of thinking about this context, there are sort of agroecology movements for smaller scale farmers in Brazil, like the MST is notable for this. They have their own schools. They try to, instead of using or relying on techniques that are sort of capital intensive or require financing, like herbicides and such, they use native species, or they have mixed crops, as opposed to pesticides and that sort of thing. But I'm not. I think that there is a lot of room for attention to those kinds of agroecology movements in this context of the manual cane cutters, the people that I work with as well. That's not. That's in the terms of life as it's lived now, and not necessarily in sort of traditional horticultural techniques. That is so oftentimes in this context, sort of default terms for politics, and so. So I like the attention to that. I think it's actually quite sort of hopeful in thinking about the communities that are being affected by biofuels. So.
Just a question, a follow-up question. People in the camps, what are their demands? What do they actually want to happen, especially the Guarani?
So the way they articulate their demands are in the terms in which they can achieve the land demarcation. So you can have ethnic land titles in Brazil if the land is necessary, and this is the language, necessary to reproduce your culture. So they invoke the traditional ways of life, cosmological ties to land, horticulture, those are the terms in which you can actually make a land claim. You will not get an ethnic land title if you say, I want to start my own sugarcane plantation. Okay, so the terms in which they articulate demands for land, but I mean, there's a larger sense in which I think these claims are nevertheless valid. If you think about the historical displacement and the land claim as reaching for, like I said, reaching for a livable life, or to be themselves, as they say it. In the context of this larger historical displacement, there is a validity. They might not have been displaced from that particular parcel of land that they're claiming on a particular agribusiness plantation, and it might not be to reproduce themselves as Guarani, sort of culturally Guarani, but it is in order to be able to go on living. I mean, there's a way that there's a larger sense of validity here that is not really amenable to the terms in which they could be deemed legitimate, the claims themselves. So there's a way that something like social justice actually exceeds politics, at least the politics that's prescribed for this context. So.
Well, that's fascinating, and I encourage you guys to continue the discussion. Oh, thank you. I encourage everyone to continue the discussion over the snacks, and once again, let's thank our speakers for wonderful presentations.